Good morning. It's Thursday at 10:30, and you're with the University of Houston's Center for Carbon Management and Energy. No, it's not Groundhog Day. It's the next in our series of our 10:30 Thursday webinars. And I think today you'll find the subject and our speaker today probably about as good as it gets. With carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and the challenges associated with project development in terms of building, executing, financing, etc. Uh, Nobody with a better, stronger set of experiences than David Greeson. Um, I'd like to welcome you all again to our activities here at the university. We're uh, we're delighted that you're able to join us. I think I've said this in the past, but for those of you joining one of the first times here with our center, welcoming you to our center, where we're really committed to meeting the challenges of the energy trilemma in the energy marketplace. It's about having reliable and available energy to meet the growth needs and the reliability needs of energy globally. It's also having the environmental responsibility in terms of the way that energy is produced and consumed, the carbon footprint, and that can be from carbon dioxide, from methane, and all of the associated additional environmental challenges that are involved with energy growth and the sustaining energy needs in our world. And underpinning all of that is the consistency around providing it in an affordable manner so that it's cost competitive, citizens around the world can enjoy it, and that energy, which is really the enabler for global activities, can occur. So as we look at that energy trilemma, we're fundamentally basing ourselves on not being uh, connected specifically to a technology or to a point of view that's anything other than having all fuels, all technologies, and all manners in which we're able to meet the energy challenge going forward addressed, addressing it in an environmentally responsible way, and of course, having it be affordable. So today's series is again a continuation of what we've been doing in the month of April, what we intend to continue to do into the month of May, and it has been every Thursday at 10:30. We're delighted that you've taken the time to join us in these strange and unusual times, but it's a great way to stay connected, and it's a great way for us, hopefully, to introduce you to the Center for Carbon Management here at the university, many of our industry supporters. But on top of that, the strong support from the marketplace with NGOs, with governmental agencies, the public-private partnership that's necessary to advance this forward. And so we view this as important for Houston and the Gulf Coast, important for the United States, and ultimately important very much globally. And so a big part of what we do here is focus on what we can act on here locally, but have a global view with the global participation that we have in our center. Encourage you to to visit our website to see the kinds of technologies and other activities we're doing in business, in policy, in legal activities as well. Uh, Not only engineering and science, which is fundamental to the transformation that we're going through, but also to have all of the supporting functional capabilities necessary for us to achieve that energy transition. For the month of April, we're blessed and thankful to have the sponsorship of Hunton, Andrews, and Kurth. Many of the attorneys at Hunton are UH grads here in town, Cougars, that are continuing their support, but also from the standpoint of the legal dynamics that are changing in the marketplace and Hunton's commitment to carbon management and the transition that's going on. We're very thankful for their support and have very much appreciated them getting behind our webinar series in the month of April. Next week, you'll have a different kind of webinar. It's the responsibilities and liabilities that organizations face these days with climate speech. What does that mean? It's really the whole issue of, as an organization, as an enterprise, what are you talking about to the external community? How do you see it positioned with investors, shareholders, with employees, with the communities in which you work? Our Victor Flatt and Tracy Hester from our law school will present an overview and maybe even a little bit of a back and forth with each other in terms of perspectives and point of views, in terms of the ethics, the responsibilities, and the liabilities that come with that. And of course, this is a dynamic situation. It's been looked at in many different ways from a legal standpoint. And I think you'll find the discussion quite interesting from not only the energy transition, but also as enterprises look at their sustainability going forward, and whether that's corporate social responsibility, environmental and social governance, how people and organizations are looked at through the Dow Jones Sustainability Index and many of the other ranking agencies that there are. It's an important topic and it's evolving. So I think you'll enjoy the conversation. And then starting out our series in May will be a digitization discussion of the energy industry. Greg Bean is the executive director of our Gutierrez Energy Management Institute here at the Bauer School for Business. And digitalization is a discussion topic. It's certainly hot on the minds of many in the industry these days of how work processes will change. It's been changing, but certainly the events of the last several months have caused us to relook at work processes, how we're doing our work, how digitalization will come about. Greg has recently authored a white paper in support from not only the Bauer School of Business, but also our University of Houston Energy Center here. And that white paper will be the foundation for the webinar. And I think you'll find it a very interesting and certainly timely topic going forward. We'd encourage you again to learn more about our webinar series by going to our link and coming into our web page. University of Houston Energy, the Center for Carbon Management and Energy, and learning about not only the research programs that we're supporting and developing throughout that, but it also gives you a keyway into many of the other departments at the university. And I think you'll find it a useful tool. Also learning more about the webinar series generally, but more specifically about any research topics that could be of interest to you. As we get into the prepared remarks prior to the Q&A session, I'd like to remind you that there is a chat function on this webinar, Zoom, that we're all learning about and getting more familiar with every day. I hope you've also selected up at the top the speaker view for the viewing of the presentation and also the Q&A. If you do the view options, you'll also see that there's an opportunity to do the side-by-side, select side-by-side. That way you'll be able to see not only the presentation material, but also participate in the chat. So as the presentation is being presented to you, please send your questions in. We'll do our best to group them and try to answer as broad a base of those questions as we can. But then also during the Q&A, this chat function will also be available to you. So as questions spur additional questions, feel free to jump in. So What I'd like to do now is to talk a little bit about the road we've traveled, the journey that's ahead, CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We talked about it in great length last week during our webinar in terms of what it's going to take to make investment possible, where the most likely opportunities for it. It's a very challenging time. We understand that. And certainly the journey up to this point has been difficult, but it's also been fraught with a lot of challenges. And at the same time, we've learned so much. I think the fundamental takeaway, though, from the journey today versus what many people may look at in the past is that it is a commercially proven, demonstrated technology. It's not something that's still being just researched. It's not a science project. It's a commercially available technology that is fundamentally important to the solutions going forward as we look at a lower carbon future. The National Petroleum Council has recently put out a study. Took 18 months to pull this together with many participants across the marketplace, over 300 different participants, not only from industry, but academia, NGOs, the marketplace, governmental activities as well. And it's dedicated to showing that roadmap of how we get CCUS deployed broadly, globally. But it's also very pragmatic from the standpoint of using existing technologies that are proven and demonstrated, and short-term selecting places in the world where the opportunities for deployment and commercial success are the most ripe. And I guess that's a big part of what we want to talk about today in terms of once that assessment and analysis has been made, then it really moves to the next step of how does one get something to happen. Can't think of anybody better than David Greeson to talk about getting it done. What are the keys to project success? You have to have a fundamental story to start from in terms of what is the reason for the project in the first place, what are the essential elements of it, what are the essential participation that's going to be involved with not only the builders and the project execution people, but the ownership, the clients, the marketplace, and how does it fit. Site-specific details are really, really important. It's not just a place where carbon is captured, but it then needs to be delivered to geological formations where it will either be enhanced oil recovery or potentially stored carbon in the ground, and that will need to be safe and permanently demonstrated. Getting the cost estimates and scope right is really challenging. It's expensive and can be incredibly time consuming. But I think you'll hear a bit about David's experiences and how you get the kind of cost estimates and scoping that's required. You need to have the right team committed to the whole, not just the pieces and parts. There are many contractors, EPC firms, technology providers, the like. And everyone has a piece and a part to contribute, but there needs to be a real ownership of the whole and how ultimately that project in its holistic form will be able to deliver value. And that leads to the clear business purpose and ultimately the customer. It gets to understanding what kind of customer needs are being met. And again, it's not a science project. It needs to be commercially viable and needs to deliver results. And all of that gets to the fact of ownership. These projects will need to be owned and operated, and it'll be a living, breathing organism for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And it needs to deliver value, and that ownership team being committed to everything it takes to be a good owner. I have a good friend of mine who has said this in any number of meetings over the past 20 years, and I love it every time he says it. When all is said and done, more often than not, more is said than what is done. And I'll tell you, it's never, never more obvious when the details matter, The people matter, the commitment matters. And it's not just about talking about it, it's actually doing it and be actionable. And so with that, I'm going to hand the presentation over to David Greeson, who is primary in the execution and the success of the Petra Nova project right here in the Houston area. But David has also continued his career beyond that, even today, with a number of different projects that are being developed across the country. Most recently, the project Tundra, and David will tell you a bit about that. But in terms of pulling it all together, being recognized, not only here in the US, but really globally, no finer person than David Greeson, and we're delighted to have him today. So with that, let's turn the presentation over to David, and we'll run through that. Again, reminding you the chat function is available. Use it, please. And we'll take your questions, and David will be able to provide, I think, a lot of insights that you'll welcome. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Chuck. Can't thank you enough for those kind words. Well, here we are today, folks. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about successful carbon capture development, but in a lot of ways, the things we're going to talk about today apply to pretty much any development project. So I guess I want to start off with a few kind of basics about my approach to development so you'll understand where I'm coming from. It is certainly not the only way to develop a project, but these are the kind of guiding principles that have helped me be successful over the years. And so I want to just take a minute to talk about those before we launch into some more specifics about power plant or project development. First off, if you're the kind of person that sees the world as somewhat of a zero-sum game, where if I need something, if I get something, it means I need to take it from others. If you're the kind who in a negotiation thinks the only way you get something is for you to take it from the other side, kind of in a win-lose scenario, then you're probably not going to appreciate the principles that we're going to talk about as we go through today's session. I'm very much a believer that value is something that's created. And to that end, when you think about there is no limit on the value you can create, then when you need something and the other side needs something and it looks like you have to either take it from each other, you probably need to step back and think about, is there another way to create a value or a term where both sides get what they need? And it may not be what you're looking at or what's right in front of you. There may be other ways for both of you to achieve the old cliche, a win-win situation. I'll also say that, if you're going to be the leader of a development effort and you believe, or you're the kind of person that needs to come up with all the ideas and you can't share the, if you will, glory of solving a problem, if you can't look to your team to be the ones who solve the problems, and you're probably going to not really appreciate what I'm talking about here. Most developments are very complicated, and it's pretty rare to find one person who can solve all the problems that are going to come in front of you. And for carbon capture in particular, these are very complex deals. Especially now with 45Q, it's going to be very difficult for there to be one person on the team who can solve all the problems, all the engineering problems, the accounting problems, the tax problems, the legal problems, the permitting problems, the operational problems, the constructability. There are just so many things and take so many disciplines. You have to be the kind of leader who basically facilitates everyone on the team to solve problems, not look to you to be the one that solves the issues when they pop up, and they will pop up. there are some people who like to lead teams in a way where they feel like if there's friction on the team, that tension creates a better product at the end of the day. That kind of trial by fire, when people are arguing and pitted against each other, they somehow become more creative, and it's that competitive juices on the team among the team members that leads to solutions and to a project. I find that too stressful and can't imagine going through a 1, 2, or 3 year development cycle to get a project off the ground, and live in an environment where everybody is at each other's throats just for the sake of the leader feeling like they're doing their job. I find the exact opposite works, where if everybody on the team respects each other and is looking for ways to help the other team members be as successful as they're trying to be, everything works better. Everybody can celebrate victories together, and it just spurs further working together to hammer out the solutions to problems when they pop up. So I'm very much the working atmosphere on the team needs to be highly collaborative, highly supportive of one another, and everybody cheering the other, for example, engineering to solve a problem. Everybody comes together to try and help that team member overcome whatever's in front of them. I guess the last thing I'd like to say is that about kind of the overall approach is I've learned that what works best, I've learned from others that I've watched in the many years I've been doing this. I've been in the business a while, and I've seen a lot of projects. I've led a few, as you can see on my bio here. So far, I've been successful in just about every project that we've undertaken in a serious way. There obviously have been projects that have popped up over the years that we've taken a look at, but elected for one reason or another, either it's not a good fit or we didn't see a pathway for investors to get what they needed out of a project, that we've let them go. But the ones that we've said, okay, this is it, we've been pretty successful on. So let's start talking about the specifics of running a development project and how to be successful. As the title says here, it's difficult. You don't hear about all the failures that happen out there, but I can assure you that for every project that you get an announcement for on your LinkedIn link or through your news feed, there's probably 10 or 20 or more projects that either have failed or are perpetually trying to achieve some measure of success. So when you hear about a project that gets over the finish line, the people who are putting out the press release are not just patting themselves on the back. It is a real celebration, because it is hard to make one of these things work. And so you can't rely on just luck, or that other people will do it for you, or that somehow it'll fall into your lap. These things happen because people come together and people decide they want to do this. And that's going to kind of be a theme as we finish out the rest of this podcast or webcast. You're going to hear me talk about people, because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about. This is about either people doing something or people getting something, but it's all about people. I'd like to start with the idea that you really need a dedicated, highly skilled team. And by that, I mean, they don't necessarily have to be the, say, Harvard graduate or, the kind of person that was top of their class in, business school. What you need is somebody who is going to put in the energy. They have the skills, they have the background, they have all the requisite training to do their part of the project, but they also need to be highly dedicated. Somebody with the ability to say, okay, for the next 2, 3, 4 years of my life, I am going to make this the top work priority for what I'm going to do. Obviously, there needs to be private life balance here, but for the time that they're going to spend working on work, they need to be 100% focused on being successful at this development project. And the leader needs to, above all, for the sake of the team, needs to be very single-minded and the person that kind of keeps everybody focused on the goal. And so if you're looking to be on a development team, look for a leader who the only thing that matters is to them as far as developing this project is being successful. And to that end, everybody on the team, and the team I'm talking about here is very broad. It's more stakeholders, but the team, the core team that's working on the project has to be and has to exhibit and commit to each other that they are there to make this a successful effort. They're not there to simply pound out 8 hours a day and get one day closer to retirement. This has to be something that is in their core, something they want to see happen, and they're willing to give it their all to make it happen. Now, companies, private equity, folks who fund development efforts, they're not going to sit around and pour unlimited amount of dollars and give you unlimited time to get these projects done. So it's very important that you sit down with your funders, with whoever is providing the resources for you to do this development project. It's very, very important that you have a clear understanding of what their budget is and what they're willing to spend and what amount of time they're willing to give you. Now, on the other side, you need to provide them with counsel on what's reasonable. What amount of money would be needed in order to get this over the finish line in your judgment and in your experience, and same with the schedule. So everybody understanding and very transparently knowing what amount of money is available to spend, what you expect to spend it on, and what schedule you expect to achieve the milestones on. Doesn't mean that life is going to turn out that way, but if you don't start out with a clear set of constraints on what the development effort is going to be, it'll end up being one of those projects that just gets worked on, but never closes. As you can see in my little takeaway box there's lots of projects out there that get millions of dollars of resources, millions of man hours of time committed to that they just never go anywhere. They seem like a good idea. You get a big rush at first, but then they just don't get focus and they just kind of flounder, and they end up being a real drain on not only the financial resources, but on the human resources as well. So be thinking about your effort as being a closer, someone who's going to take this to the end, and we are going to get this done one way or another. And to that end, I want to say that all of this doesn't matter if you don't deliver value to the stakeholders. And by stakeholders, that's a broad community of people. That's everybody on your team. That is the investors that are funding the development effort. That's the regulators who have spent political capital issuing you a permit. That is the politicians who have spent some of their public goodwill on your behalf to get whatever approvals or acceptance are needed. It's landowners that are impacted. It's vendors who are committing to deliver at a fixed price or a certain price to your facility, and they're guaranteeing performance. So all those folks are the people I call stakeholders, and they all need to be a part of the win in this case. So I want to talk a little bit about how you get started. And, it typically comes to a development team as an idea from an executive or from an entrepreneur of some kind. And one of the first things you need to do before you launch the effort is you got to think about, why are we doing this? What's the point? I've listed some questions here for you to look at. What are we trying to accomplish? And if we accomplish it, why would anybody care? Are we looking to build something that nobody's going to care about, or it's not going to be important in some way to people that matter? Is there a problem that this project is intended to solve? And if so, what does the successful outcome look like? What does that solution look like? And we live in a time-constrained world. Sometimes things that are solutions to problems, if they take too long to get, it's not a problem you need to solve anymore, because things have changed and we no longer need to solve that problem. So what are the deadlines for accomplishing what you're trying to accomplish so that it still has relevance by the time you get there? And of course, there's no reason to launch into a development effort if you know you don't have a line of sight on the funding that you're going to need to get to the end. So make sure that ask the question: is the budget really there to get this done? I guess when you look at all these questions and you ask, and there's probably many more questions depending on your specific example that you need to ask. But at the end of that little questioning process, you've got to write down, and if you can't write it down, then you probably need to go back and work on the questions and answers some more. But once you get that, you should be able to write what I call a project story. You should be able to explain what the project is, what success looks like at the end of the development effort, and who all is going to win, who all is going to benefit from this project. And then you look at what you look at what you're going to have to do along the way to make the thing successful. I've not been a part of a project yet where the story that we wrote before we started ended up being the storyline at the end of the project. So just remember that you're not setting this in stone, whether it's budgets or deadlines or even the definition of what you're trying to build or trying to develop. It could change throughout the course of the project. You may solve the problem. The problem you're trying to solve may end up being a development project that looks very different than the one you thought would solve the problem when you started out. So you've got to be flexible along the way. So there are 5 in my kind of way I organize it in my mind. There's kind of 5 phases of project execution. We just kind of talked a little bit about how you decide what the project is. But once you've organized and collected your core team of development, you need to all agree on what the project definition is. What is it we're planning to build here? Everybody on the team is going to need that definition so they can do their part of the project. Legal is going to need to know, what are you trying to build, and who are the people that are going to be needed, and what agreements are we going to need to get there? Same way, obviously, with engineering and licensing and permitting. All those folks that are on your team are going to need a clear definition of what we're trying to accomplish. Then they can go out and do their discipline, their contribution, their part of the project, so that it feeds into and becomes a part of the project story at the end in a successful way. So then from that, each of your disciplines can go out and start doing the work that they need to do. And, engineering has a certain sequence that they need to go through to develop a concept of what a project would look like. The finance folks will go through a process to develop a pro forma to put together the finance plan. Each of the disciplines then can launch on their process, and usually at this point, it's a good idea for everybody to come back together after they've had a few weeks or a month or two to think about what their particular parts or their assigned sections of the project look like. Come together fairly quickly and say, have we found anything that doesn't look like we thought it would? Are there things here that would say it's probably not solvable, or if it's too difficult to overcome, should we rethink the project story? Should we realign the project? Should we do something different? So that's what I'm kind of calling the design and costing phase, where you do an initial set of effort to figure out, are you doing something here? Are you headed on a pathway that looks like it's possible to get to the end? And you may not have all the answers at this point, but if you can fill in the gaps sometimes with people and their expertise, and you can kind of see where there are areas that need to be shored up, and this will be the time where you bring in extra resources to cover that. So then once you've launched out of that part of that phase of the project, then you're into the detailed design, the licensing, the permitting. That's the time when most of the money is spent on a project development. You're putting together the next phase there, all the contracts. This is where legal really becomes involved. And the financing team starts putting together their concept of how we're going to get to a closing, how we're going to get through construction and then into operations. And then finally, once you've had that closing at the end of that fourth phase, construction. And I would say that it's been my experience that development doesn't end with the start of construction. Development really needs to continue through, because once you start building the project, all the assumptions, all the design work that you've done to get to that point, this is where the constructor turns it into reality. And sometimes those assumptions were off. Sometimes things didn't work out like you had thought they would. And those kinds of issues pop up during construction, and you really need your whole development team available to solve those problems, to address those issues whenever they pop up. So I've done a few projects, and one of the ones that people want to know about the most, obviously, and the reason I'm here today is to talk about the Petra Nova project. But I also want to cover one of what I believe is probably the next coal-fired carbon capture project to go through the development process, and that's Project Tundra in North Dakota. First off, we'll talk about Petra Nova. When we did that project, we started out with a dedicated team. The NRG CEO at that time was a real believer that corporate overhead, corporate oversight sometimes can squash or inhibit early stage development ideas. And so he was a real believer that we should pull a team out, literally make them quit their day jobs, if you will, rather than working on this part-time. Pull them out, put them on this full time, do or die. This is your job. Make this thing happen. And so we had a team of 5 that were initially pulled out for that purpose. And we knew that the bridge had been burned behind us, and we were going to make this project work and continue. And over the years that it took to develop this project, we had to make enough progress to keep our funder, which was NRG at the time, interested in continuing to fund the project. And so it was clear what our goal was. We were on a mission to demonstrate that this technology was ready for utility scale. We had to, by definition from the CEO, do this project in a way that did not impact the profitability or the commercial prospects of the host coal plant. Because people have been talking about how expensive carbon capture is, and it is expensive. I'm not diminishing that at all. But we had a goal to make sure that we did not impact the economic viability of the host coal unit. And remember, this coal unit was competing in the ERCOT energy-only market. So loading up a bunch of cost of carbon capture on the coal plant would have meant that the coal plant didn't dispatch, and if it didn't dispatch, then there was no flue gas for us to harvest CO2 out of. So it was very much a circular but win-win for us. If we could keep the coal plant dispatching, then we could continue to get CO2 through our carbon capture system, and we both win from that. So we ended up going down a pretty twisted path. We started out with a 60 megawatt idea of a capture system. We proposed that to the Department of Energy to help fund the not only the cost of the development, because the way that the DOE grant was working at the time was they would fund you in 2 phases: a development or project definition phase is what they called it, and then an actual implementation or construction phase. So we were selected for a grant for a 60 megawatt capture system, but then to honor to achieve our goal of not impacting the economics of the coal plant, we needed a revenue source. And we fortunately were located on the Texas Gulf Coast. There are a number of oil fields up and down the Texas coast that are ready for CO2, but because of the location, they're so remote to existing sources of CO2, most of these oil fields had no chance of getting CO2. Even if there was excess CO2 in the producing basin of South Colorado and northern New Mexico, where they produce CO2 out of the ground, there was such a demand in the Permian Basin between the Gulf Coast and those resources, CO2 was never going to make it to the Gulf Coast. And so oil field operators knew that if they were going to have a shot, it was going to be anthropogenic. So we were very fortunate to hook up with an oil company that had that vision, that had a number of oil fields that were ready for CO2 floods. And so we were able to work out an arrangement to where the project would invest in the oil field and get its share of oil produced from CO2 injection. And that then the proceeds or the profits from selling the oil would pay for the carbon capture system. And we, worked with the oil company and figured out the ratios so that we got enough revenue in the pro forma from our side to pay for the CapEx and the OpEx of the carbon capture system. So we were very focused, as I mentioned, my approach is very focused on making sure all stakeholders win. When we hit snags like understanding that 60 megawatts of CO2 was not going to be enough CO2 to cover or to create a oil production stream that would support the project, we knew we had to get bigger. unfortunately, the Department of Energy's hands were tied. They couldn't increase the grant. And so we had a big challenge there to overcome, making the project big enough to get enough oil produced to pay for itself, but we weren't getting any more help, any additional help from the Department of Energy grant. So we had a lot of thinking to do there, not impacting the operations at the plant. In the energy-only market in ERCOT, flexibility is something that's highly valued. And if we were to take extraction steam out of the host unit, could seriously impact the flexibility of that unit. And in addition, at the time, it wasn't clear at all that doing that kind of a modification to extract steam out of the coal unit, it could have triggered new source review under the Clean Air Act, which would have put us in a whole different category of risk and a whole different category of what it would take to get a permit to do that. So along the way, we put in a cogeneration system, gas-fired cogeneration system. So yes, we're using natural gas to solve CO2 emission problems from a coal unit. But at every step along the way, we were careful to make sure that the DOE was getting what they needed, that we were accomplishing the goals that NRG had set out. Ultimately, we found an unbelievably great partner in JX Nippon Oil and Gas Exploration. They saw the vision of this project. They wanted to be a part of this demonstration. And so they came in as a 50-50 partner. And so as we're talking about making sure stakeholders got what they were looking for, JX was definitely in that group, and we believe that they got what they were looking for in that development. The oil field needed, the operator needed a certain amount of revenues to make it worthwhile for them to go down this path. And so we were balancing their needs as well. And then there were all the wonderful vendors that helped make this happen. Nobody did this as a contribution. All the vendors got paid their a reasonable price for the work or the equipment that they provided. And as we hit issues during construction, because everybody had received what they considered a fair deal, they were just as interested in solving the problems as the owners were. So we were all pulling in the same direction to get over the humps that came along. So in the end, the Petra Nova project was successfully placed into service for reasons that were beyond their control. The price of oil fell dramatically during the construction of Petra Nova, and so it fell below the level that we had expected in the pro forma. And oil production turned out to be a different shape curve. In other words, the amount of oil that we expect to produce from this oil field is unchanged, but the pace at which we're going to be able to get the oil out is different than what the models had told us. So oil production is not following the curve that we had in the pro forma, and the price of oil, obviously, and gosh, with what's happened in the last week, with oil prices going negative, nobody certainly expected that. So economically, the project has been challenged, but from a technology standpoint, the carbon capture system is working as guaranteed by Mitsubishi. The ability to inject CO2 and for it to be stored in the oil field is working as modeled. Things in the project from a technology standpoint are working, and the cost to operate the capture system, the cost to operate the oil field, which is no small number in and of itself, are all within pro forma. The only thing that's not performing as expected is the is the oil production side. So revenues are not where we wanted them to be. Now, it's been a few years since that project came online, and I think it's given enough time to show that the technology is resilient. We weren't just able to operate for a demonstration test and then shut it down. It's been operating for almost 4 years now, or just over 4 years, and operating well. 45Q was passed, and as we all know, there are a number of projects out there that are looking to get under construction by the deadline by the end of 2023. And one of those is a project called Project Tundra in North Dakota. And I've been privileged with helping that project move along. And, they're following the same pattern that we had for Petra Nova. They've set up a dedicated team. These people are really good at what they do. They're all excited about seeing this project happen. It couldn't be a more helpful and encouraging environment in North Dakota. They understand oil and gas operations in that state, whether it's individuals in the community, whether it's community leaders or state leaders. Everybody understands oil and gas there, and they understand injecting things in the ground is just what's been happening for over 100 years. People know how to do these things. The technologies for doing this are there. There's a lot of coal in North Dakota. They're excited about retaining the jobs, and they're also excited about the possibility of addressing carbon issues with coal. So you just couldn't ask for a better situation. You've got Minn Kota, the project sponsor, who's created a dedicated team. They've given us a clear goal and a clear set of budget guidelines. And with the 45Q, we certainly have a deadline that we have to get all this done by. So it's project is moving along. I personally, because I'm the eternal optimist, I believe that we'll be under construction by the end of 2021. That's next year. Others are telling us I should temper that a little bit and tell people that we will be under construction by mid-2022. But either way, we are moving through the process. The Class 6 permit for injecting CO2 into permanent geologic storage is turning out to be the long pole in the tent, if you will. It's the critical path to getting to construction. And it's going to take us until the third quarter of next year, at least, maybe even longer, depending on how the process pans out. But in the meantime, we've got a FEED study underway. There's just a lot of effort going into this project, and we're seeing the results. So just trying to look ahead, I have made it no secret that I believe that liquid amine is a proven technology. It's ready for commercial deployment at utility scale. Of course, Fluor and Mitsubishi and Cansolv, they'll continue to improve their processes. They'll continue to find a way to get the cost down. And that's needed because, like I said, it's expensive. But I also believe that there are other technologies out there that promise an opportunity to get the cost down even more, and maybe in a step function way. So what I see ahead is that technologies like Savante and MTR with membrane technology, these are folks who are coming up with different ways to separate CO2 from flue gas. And on the surface, it looks like they may have significant cost advantages. And so we're cheering them on. If we're going to see worldwide deployment, it's probably going to come from either dramatic improvements in liquid amine technology or from some of this disruptive technology from other folks like I've highlighted here. There is nothing like in all of these companies that are providing technology, will tell you there is nothing like actually doing it at scale to learn how to improve your process. So hats off to the U.S. government and passing the 45Q improvements that they did in 2018. It's that kind of government support, the way they supported the wind industry, that's going to get projects actually built, and the learnings from that are going to help us really improve this. And it's got to improve if we're going to see worldwide deployment. And then I think that what we're going to see, and I'm hoping we're going to see, a shift in attitudes toward fossil fuels. You hear in the press a lot about we've got to end fossil fuel. Everybody wants that's claims to be an environmentalist is saying things like we need to get rid of fossil fuels. But I believe that if you look at what it is that people don't like about fossil fuels, it's the carbon emissions. And so it's not the fossil fuel. Fossil fuels have raised the economic propositions of everyone on the planet. The availability of dense, readily available and low-cost energy from fossil fuels has really changed the prospects for everybody on the planet. And so throwing out fossil fuels, it seems like you're undoing all the good that's been done. So if carbon emissions are the real problem, then let's address that. Why end or why try and eliminate fossil fuels? It doesn't make any sense to me. We have the technology. This next generation that's coming up likes technology. They believe technology can solve problems. Well, let's use technology to solve the problem with fossil fuels. Let's not throw away this low-cost energy source that's going to help raise people out of poverty as it becomes even more widely available in developing nations. Why deprive them of the opportunity to raise themselves up if we can find a way to help mitigate or to deal with the real problem, which is the CO2 emissions? So with that, Chuck, I'm going to turn it back to you. That's the end of my prepared remarks, and I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Well, again, I want to remind everyone there to use the chat function on the webinar, and continue to provide any insights or questions that you might want to ask. Several of them did come in during the presentation, David. So let me try to hit a few at you here as part of your remarks. You mentioned several times about fossil fuels and these two facilities that you've worked on as coal plants. Really, across our country, we look at natural gas abundance and cost, et cetera, and it seems as though many coal plants have been retired, but gas plants coming in as well. And so both of them have CO2 emissions. What do you see as the future for fossil fuel generally, that being coal, oil, natural gas, to produce power and use this technology and produced what I've heard you describe very many times as 24/7 baseload power? It's really a unique value proposition in terms of emissions free, unless of course you're looking at nuclear. What do you see as the future for natural gas, David?
Well, I think the natural gas and the flexibility that comes with natural gas fired units are a perfect complement to the intermittency of renewables. Yes, there are carbon emissions, but they're dramatically lower than you would expect from a baseload unit. The problem with, as it stands today with the current state of technology, Chuck, is with trying to put carbon capture on gas-fired plants, is the technology for burning gas and making electricity is a combustion turbine, and the volume of flue gas, it's a mass flow machine. So they're trying to push as much air through as possible with as little fuel as possible. So the ratio of of carbon dioxide in the flue gas is very low, that makes it very dilute, while you have to handle the same volume of flue gas that a solid fuel unit would have. You only control a very small amount of carbon dioxide. And that problem gets even worse if the gas-fired plant is in cyclic duty, if it's being used to clip off peaks in the load curve. So if you're not loading these carbon capture systems 24/7, the economics become even more challenging. So I think it's going to be something like the MTR membrane technology, or something like that, that's very low capital cost, maybe with a little bit of an energy penalty, but low capital cost, that will be the answer for CO2 emissions from gas plants.
So David, speak a little bit about siting of these facilities. Obviously, power plants, we're not talking about greenfield operations all the time. Many times it's important to go after existing facilities, fossil plants with the emissions. Being able to link sources of CO2 to the sinks of where it can go geologically. If I recall, the Petra Nova project required something like an 80-mile pipeline. That seems like a long distance, but then as you begin to look at the volumes of CO2 that can be aggregated in places like the US Gulf Coast, that infrastructure piece can be impacted dramatically, can it not?
It can be impacted dramatically, and it has a huge impact on the cost of carbon capture. Uh, uh, you hear people talking now, because of this, about a part of the infrastructure bill possibly being a build out of a national CO2 pipeline network. Siting, as you started with the question, is critical. Anybody can catch CO2. What do you do with it after you catch it is the big question. And right now, the only technology we have on the planet to put away or to deal with the volumes of CO2 that we're talking about is geologic storage, either in oil fields or in secured geologic formations. So if your power plant doesn't happen to be located next to one of those, you've got to transport it. And while pipelines are the most efficient and safest way to transport carbon dioxide, they're expensive. So the closer you can get to shorten the pipe, or as you mentioned, the more you can aggregate to spread the cost over a bigger volume, the better.
Yeah, that says a lot about our region, doesn't it, David? I mean, if you look at Houston, the US Gulf Coast generally, stretching over into Louisiana and even into Mississippi, there seems to be good linkage of geologies as well as the point sources. Seems to me to be an obvious place where more projects probably should get an early look. But of course, you mentioned obviously North Dakota and the linkage to the oil and gas geology there. Um, do you have other thoughts, I guess, as you look around the world, other places where first mover projects could be advantageous?
Um, Storage in some parts of the world is very difficult. The Japanese have very few options for storing CO2, for example. But there are other parts of the world where there's beautiful geology for storing CO2, and they happen to be in close proximity to very large CO2 sources. So uh, I think worldwide the issue remains the same. You need to be able to do something with the carbon dioxide, and if you're in a country or in a geography that has either old oil fields like in the Middle East, or some favorable formations like you find in many other parts of the world, uh, that will be your opportunity to put in a carbon capture system.
You mentioned enhanced oil recovery, both at Petra Nova, as also up at Project Tundra. Um, do you see the applicability, given the fact that 45Q addresses both CO2 for geologic storage only, as well as CO2 for enhanced oil recovery and then safe and permanent storage? Do you see an opportunity for these projects to take advantage of both of those, both storage and enhanced oil recovery, and perhaps be able to ride through some of the vagaries of the oil market? Obviously, we're looking at pricing these days we would have never expected. Is that something that ought to enter people's minds as they look forward in terms of these projects and being able to maybe have a broader portfolio of sales options?
Absolutely, Chuck. As I mentioned, these projects are huge upfront capital undertakings, and the idea that you're going to raise that much capital on a Petra Nova style revenue stream, which depends on oil price and oil production, probably is not viable going forward. So it's going to be, for at least a while, the projects that get done are going to be those projects that can access permanent geologic storage, can count on the $50 per ton that's in 45Q. They'll get finance based on that, and then opportunities to divert CO2 from storage to enhanced oil recovery would be considered upside opportunities for not only the project, but for the states in which these projects are located, as well as the oil operators.
Yeah, that seems like a kind of a pragmatic approach to creating a portfolio. Each of those, storage and enhanced oil recovery, present maybe unique geological challenges. Can you speak to those challenges, maybe comparing and contrasting in terms of, I guess, the risk and ultimately the uncertainty, perhaps, of either of those approaches?
Well, the good news is, Chuck, that Mother Nature has already told us where the good places to store CO2 are. An oil field is an oil field because it's sealed, and oil that's been percolating up from lower layers gets trapped in a sealed formation. So for many eons of years, these formations in oil fields have held hydrocarbons and carbon dioxide and methane and other gases. So we know when you find an oil field, you probably have a very good candidate for a place to store CO2. Then likewise for the geologic storage in saline formations, again, these formations are holding, most of the time they're holding them at pressure, holding water and other fluids in their formation, salty water, and it's under pressure, and that tells you, because it's pressurized, that it's sealed. If it was leaking, the pressures would normalize and you wouldn't see overpressure. So as we go through the process to either license an enhanced oil recovery project or a Class 6 geologic storage facility, there's a very rigorous process to demonstrate to the agencies and to the public that the formation you've targeted is going to hold the CO2 and hold it permanently.
So with that in mind, as you look forward, you mentioned that there's no substitute, that you can't do any better really than learning by doing. And so we all talk about the first plant, the second plant, the nth plant. I thought it was interesting during the National Petroleum Council study where the improvements that might be seen over time may be attributed to building that nth plant and certainly the scaling. The National Petroleum Council did not take advantage of any magical thinking or technology changes that might occur otherwise. So As you look forward, what kind of improvements might we expect in terms of capital cost, and maybe for that matter, even operating cost and the ability to deliver CO2?
Yeah, absolutely. I stand by what I said, that learning by doing is invaluable, and there's no substitute for it. The wind generators over the last 30 years have gotten so much better by doing. That they learn by putting these things out into the real world, let them blow, let them turn, and see what problems need to be solved, and also at the same time learn how uh, to do that technology in a way that makes it more efficient, more cost effective. And that pattern holds with just about any technology that humans have undertaken. The more you do them, the better you get at it, and the lower the price will get.
You want to speculate on 10%, 20%, 30%, or is that something aspirational we would just search for?
Well, for liquid amine, the physics of that technology um, are fairly well known, and so I think we'll see. Mitsubishi has already said that they think they can get a more than 15% reduction in the next copy of the Petra Nova project that they build. They think they learned enough in building and designing and watching the operations of that facility that they'll get another at least 15%. Um, uh, I think that as we go through, the generation after that, if it follows a typical technology maturity curve, you'll see a little bit less in the next generation, maybe a 10% improvement over that, and it'll be asymptotic. But the liquid amine just requires so much steel and so much stainless steel that there's kind of a natural uh, asymptote there, that it's just not going to get cheaper than certain levels without some kind of step function change in the way that technology works. And that's why I mentioned the other technologies. Those actually have the opportunity to create that step function, to instead of having to build projects over the next 20 years to achieve a 20 to 30% reduction. Those other technologies may offer in the next 5 to 7 years that kind of reduction in cost to capture carbon dioxide.
Yeah, we used to have those conversations a lot at the Department of Energy. It was really a two-pronged approach. You needed to build, learn, develop, build that nth plant. The whole build out process of doing it was incredibly important, but it was not simply the silver bullet. That transformational technology that you're talking about requires investment. It requires a will to continue to push that through universities, national labs, et cetera. I mean, there's no substitute for that. But aspirationally, I think we're all hoping that as we go forward, and sort of expecting as we go forward, that it will get better and better. David, let me switch gears on you a little bit. I've had a number of questions come in about the whole process around Class 6 wells. You referred to it as the long pole in the tent, and the difficulties and the challenges, and maybe even just the work process of getting one of those in place and having it be such that the IRS would approve some type of a program for measuring, monitoring, and verifying and validating what it is that's being stored in the ground to be able to get those tax credits. Can you reflect a bit on those processes and what you're seeing ahead, I guess, as headwinds to be able to achieve that at Project Tundra?
Absolutely, Chuck. The Class 6 well is a design standard. It's not really a new way to drill. There's nothing novel about the idea of a Class 6 well other than the materials that are required to construct the well, and then a monitoring plan that's required to go along with it. So there's no real technological jump there for Class 6. The reason it takes so long is the process to get licensed as a Class 6 well requires all that geologic characterization that I mentioned earlier, where we find a formation, we prove to ourselves and we prove to our regulators and the public that that formation can hold the fluids that we're going to inject into them. And that just takes time. It takes time to do seismic work, to drill test wells, to get core samples of the rock and the seal rock, and then to develop a geologic model and show everybody what's going to happen whenever we inject CO2 into that formation. So generally, it's looking like for most people that it takes about a year to collect all the data and submit a complete application to the agencies. In North Dakota, they have primacy on Class 6, a huge advantage for them. Not in what the Class 6 well will be. It's not in what's going to get built. What the standards for building Class 6 wells will be the same for everybody. The difference is we can talk to very easily the regulators, the folks that are managing the Class 6 program in North Dakota, and they can tell us what they're expecting to see in each of the areas of the permit in the application. So we really think that we'll be done by late summer, early fall this year on Project Tundra. We'll get an application in. Probably within a few months, the agency will issue a draft permit. So we'll know what the permit looks like, maybe by the end of this year, probably first quarter of next year. And then there are statutory timelines for public comment, for review, for agency review, all those kinds of things that can take us into the end of next year. And as I mentioned, Chuck, with the project that is looking for the 45Q tax credits to be generated by injecting into a licensed Class 6 IRS agreed to or concurred storage facility, you're not going to finance, you're not going to start construction on anything until you get that permit in your hand and everybody can see what the terms and conditions are and whether everybody's comfortable that you're going to be able to live up to it. Then you can raise the capital to build the capture system and build out the storage facility.
Sure. David, I guess the good news is, and we had this discussion in our very first webinar around 45Q about the different the different definitions around project startup and what does it take to actually qualify for being in a startup mode. You mentioned 2023, and we had some questions come in about how can you possibly get a project done by 2023. It's really not getting it done, but it's actually initiating the necessary steps to be started. Sounds like you're well within that time frame in terms of starting. Matter of fact, perhaps even some of the work that you've already done might actually fall into that category. So sounds like you're in pretty good shape there in North Dakota.
Yeah, we feel like that we'll be easily able to qualify for starting construction before the deadline. And because of the guidance that IRS has given us so far, I think that there will be other projects that are not as far along as we are, but will be able to get to that point where they can claim, rightly so, under the guidance that they have started construction before the deadline as well. So it's clear that although it took a long time for the IRS to get guidance out, it's their intent to help make the program work. They were very reasonable in what we saw so far coming out of that agency.
Well, David, I have had several questions come in, and I don't want to catch you off guard with this one, but I've known you as an electric power man from the very beginning of your career, but really more of a project man in terms of what we've been talking about here today. Questions are coming in about direct air capture and about some of these facilities that we've read about or become aware of. I don't know if you have any personal perceptions in terms of what you see in terms of project scope, ability to site one of these things, whether or not perhaps it could be a useful augmentation to additional CO2 that might go into a pipeline network. Do you have any personal observations that you could offer our audience?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Chuck, the cost of building a carbon capture machine in large part is driven by the amount of gas that you're processing. And so the higher the concentration of CO2 in that gas, the more bang for your buck, the more you're going to be able, for the capital that it's going to take to build that facility, you're going to get more carbon dioxide with the higher concentrations. And, I know people claim that the current concentrations of 400 parts per million in the atmosphere are dangerous, but when you're talking about capturing a CO2 out of a stream that's only 400 parts per million, that's a really big machine for a little bit of CO2. So my area is the people that I'm trying to help, the folks that I think are closer to technologies and to projects that are affordable, that people want to afford, people are willing to afford. I'm helping those projects with the higher concentrations, and that's to catch the flue gas before it gets into the atmosphere. Well, we're talking about 10,000 parts per million, or even in some cases 100,000 parts per million CO2. Those are the streams that are economic right now, given the current state of technology to capture. And it seems like stopping it before it gets into the atmosphere is just a better proposition than waiting and trying to catch it after it's out in the wild.
Well, appreciate your candor, David. Look, we're getting close to lunchtime for many of our viewers, and maybe I'll ask if you have any final thoughts in terms of headwinds or tailwinds that you see in the marketplace, and what you might view as the next 2, 3, 4 years of CCUS project development in this country and globally. And then maybe just reflecting on where we are right now. We're in an obvious trough in terms of economic activity. And do you see the ability to pull out of this and move forward, really the necessity of CCUS's deployment in terms of meeting global needs?
Well, I think that we were riding a pretty good tailwind up until January of this year, with the passage of 45Q, with the IRS guidance coming out. I think all that was serving to really push us forward. The DOE with their funding opportunity to fund multiple feed studies for projects. Things were headed our way. Costs are coming down. We've got Mitsubishi at a conference a year ago talking about how they think maybe even 30% is possible, depending on the site and the location of the project. On the Gulf Coast where things are and labor are readily available. But now things have kind of swung around on us, and I think that with the way that the oil market is swinging right now, you're going to see projects look to geologic storage as the backbone or the basis of getting financed, even in oil country. I think even if you were going to build a carbon capture project in the Permian Basin right now, you might have difficulty raising the capital if you're depending on an oil company to buy the CO2 at a certain price. So I really believe that geologic storage, and thank the crafters of the Future Act and 45Q for including a very robust credit for geologic storage. It's really going to be the thing that I think for the next year or two that propels projects forward and keeps us going.
Well, I think your comments are spot on, David. I don't think anyone that's been looking at CCUS has ever exclusively believed that enhanced oil recovery was the complete solution. And perhaps even as you look at things in a portfolio with an ability to create some upside value, it's always, I mean, we look at oil prices today and they're dismal, and yet, you can project out into the future. Do we get back to $30 a barrel, $50 a barrel? And as they say, the best cure for low prices is low prices. So who knows? Maybe we're back to the 80 or 90. But I think your point is well taken in terms of where this technology will go. And ultimately, the belief that 45Q will have the kind of support necessary to move it through. And that's not only politically, but also commercially to be able to move it forward. David, can't thank you enough for your comments today, your presentation. We certainly have all enjoyed it tremendously. We have a series of additional presentations that will come again, of course, next Thursday with our next presentation around the climate speech that every of the enterprises that are out there or today will be facing, whether or not they're deploying carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or whether they have a particular point of view or carbon footprint or whatever may be impacting a company or an enterprise's view in the marketplace in terms of what people see, how they're viewed, and their future obligations, risks, liabilities, and positioning the organization. Want to thank again, just flip by that last slide real quick. I want to thank Hunt Andrews and Kurth again for their sponsorship of this month's webinar series. And again, want to emphasize that next week, I think the responsibilities and liabilities of climate speech will be a topic that maybe a little less technical, certainly, but very, very impactful in terms of the business and overall profile of enterprises. So I want to thank everybody for joining us. Thank you, David, again, for your comments and insights. And we'll see you next Thursday. Thanks again.
Thanks, Chuck.